I'm really delighted to be able to be here and to be part of this event this evening. And I decided to title my talk Inter-Everything Challenges, because I think that we need to think even beyond interdisciplinarity and think about intersectoral challenges as well as interscale challenges. So you'll see that come up as themes in the research projects that I'm going to present very briefly to you in the next 20 minutes. And I'd just like to say thank you very much to Terry and all of his researchers at Sustainable Places for leading the charge internationally and for really making such a huge contribution to this conversation. So this is a slide that it's actually a photo from a research project that we have going on in the Northwest Territories in Canada. And I wanted to share this with you as the opening slide for my talk, because I think that part of the challenge of thinking about sustainability in place is constant change. I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we face in a place-based context, including in the physical world. And this photograph was taken in 1990 by a First Nations gentleman by the name of Lloyd Chicot. And this land is now underwater. And one of they've moved their camp. This is actually was a summer and winter hunting camp. It no longer is because it's underwater. But they've had to move their camp back 5 times in his lifetime. So just to make the point that we're dealing with, when we talk about sustainable places and sustainability in places together, we're talking about a very dynamic environment. And that's one of the challenges that we're facing. The next thing that I'd like to share with you is this diagram of a sustainable food system. This is the area that I work in. And the point of sharing this diagram is just to demonstrate how incredibly complex a sustainable food system is when you try to diagram it out. And this doesn't even capture everything. But what it would capture, if you could see the detail, is the fact that essentially, if we use the lens of food, for example, as a way into this conversation about sustainability, food can be seen and sustainability can be seen as a lever as well as a challenge for addressing many of the things that we're facing right now, including issues around climate change, issues around access to healthy food, and also how our ecological footprint, the extent of it or not, and also very concrete things like waste and transportation and ecological biodiversity, just as some examples that we can point to. So when we think about this complexity and challenges, those are some of the things that I'll be pointing to in the rest of my presentation. And it's also important to think about how these many pressures pull the food system in different directions. And it's difficult and complex for everybody. So we're all trying to figure out what to do. And in order to address these challenges and find solutions, we need to really be thinking in a complex, place-based, inter-everything approaches in order to improve sustainability. So what I'm going to do now is draw on my personal experience and research that I've been involved in over the last number of years. And the first project that I'm going to share with you is called Project Fledge. Fledge stands for Food Locally Embedded, Globally Engaged. And that acronym was actually coined by a colleague of Terry's here, Kevin Morgan. I borrowed that from him, so I'm grateful to him for that and other things. And it's a federally funded partnership in Canada. Our goal is to foster place-based food systems that are healthy and fair, that support local economies and regenerate the environment. So we're looking aspirationally at all the different dimensions of sustainability at once. We have 7 research nodes across Canada, and we have 3 themes that we're trying to address. The first is integrating across across sectors and disciplines. We're also looking at whether or not scaling up and out makes any sense. And in the third instance, we're looking at innovative governance and examples of that. So the cross-cutting challenges when we try to put those 3 themes together are multiple, but the ones that I want to highlight for you this evening are, first of all, making sure that the right people are sitting at the table. And that's a really complicated thing to do, and you need to work with communities for a long time before you actually know whether you're getting at that or not. So that's one challenge. Another challenge is once you have all the people sitting at the table, to make sure that all the voices are being heard, because oftentimes there are a few squeaky wheels sitting around the table, and they can dominate the conversation. So those are a couple of challenges that we've identified through this work that I'm sure everybody here I'm sure that resonates for many people as well. So in terms of Project Fledge, just to give you a sense of the extent of what we're doing, up in the Northwest Territories, we're looking at the intersection of climate change, food security, and resilience. In terms of closer to home in Ontario, where I work near Toronto, we're interested in things like non-wage labor and the intersection of that with ecologically oriented farms. So this idea of internships and people working in a sustainable environment, supposedly, and how not getting paid sort of is part of that conversation. We're also interested in things like technology and how technology can be used as a way to address some of the pressing concerns that our farmers are facing, and how we can use that to connect people within communities to the farmers. So this is an example that we have what's called Open Food Network Canada. It's the Canadian version of Open Food Network, which is an international open access global platform that allows us to address this challenge of connecting rural communities and farmers with more urban centers. Another challenge that we're dealing with specifically within food is this idea of rebuilding the missing middle. And I think that this is important because it speaks to this idea of capacity within communities that's being undermined in many different places, where we find that we don't have the infrastructure anymore to have sustainable communities because it's disappeared because of various global trade pressures and things like that. And the last example that I'd like to draw from that's directly related to Fledge is this idea of agroecology. We have an international working group that's focused on agroecology, and we've been doing a lot of work over the last few years trying to build knowledge sharing capacity really between the communities who we work with. So we'll be holding our second knowledge sharing workshop. It's sort of like a field school in August around this idea of agroecology, and the idea is to bring together people from the global south to help inform people in the global north about how to engage in agroecology and what that means and what the potential is. So it's sort of this idea of flipping ideas around where the global south is providing us in the global north with some ideas. So that's one way of dealing with challenges, is this knowledge exchange and building networks. The second project that I'd like to talk to you a little bit about is the City Region Food Systems. This is a project that we've been involved with in the last 3 years now with the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization and also with the RUEF Foundation. This is a map, an imagined map of what a city region food system would look like. And I'm just going to point out a couple of things. The idea here is that it's important to build urban-rural linkages and to think about food in a way that allows us to focus on the whole within a region as opposed to the global food system. And it's sort of a refocusing lens that helps us to do things through this approach where there's a people-centered focus, which is important in terms of the right to food. So that's one of the foci through this research. There's also an interest in multi-level governance that I'm going to speak about in a couple of minutes. This idea that you can take this approach and use it for territorial planning. So it's actually a practical tool for moving forward. And it's also a way to talk about resilient ecosystem and disaster management for the future. So clearly, when you're trying to operationalize this kind of research, the challenges that are faced are how do you cross scales and how do you develop relevant policy approaches that allow these different partners to speak to each other. And I'm going to share with you some of the results in a minute. But the first thing that I want to do is just walk you through the methodology really quickly. This is a very, very simplified version of how we went out into the field and operationalized this idea. So the first thing that we did was we would go into different communities, and there were 7 cities involved in this project. So there was 2 cities in Zambia, Kitwe and Lusaka. We were working as well in Utrecht in the Netherlands and Toronto in Canada. We also worked in Quito and Medellin, and we had another project in Colombo in Sri Lanka. So as you can imagine, there are many variations when you're trying to bring some kind of common denominator to that extent of and range of projects. So the first thing that we did was establish, we encouraged the communities to establish what their city region food system looked like. So what kind of a city region food system were we dealing with, first of all? How was it bounded? And then within that, we asked people to assess the food flows and how the food was moving within each city region food system. And then on that basis, because of that analysis, and by virtue of bringing together many different participants from across the region, so that was part of the first step, was to convene a task force that would allow us to figure out what the food system looked like and conduct this assessment. But what it also did was it facilitated conversations across these scales. So as a result of that, we had the people sitting around the table who were able to engage in policy support and participatory planning. And then also because those people were sitting at the table, there was this constant knowledge sharing, dissemination, and training that was happening as the different projects unfolded. We don't have tons of time, so I'm just going to get into 2 examples here. The first is Medellin, and the emphasis here was on territorial governance. And what we were able to realize in Medellin was that they had already, before we got there, done an extensive food flow analysis. So we had some really good data to work with to understand what their food system looked like. However, what they didn't have was a lot of connections within their regional food system. What we also realized was that there were opportunities for creating direct links between low-income consumers to existing small-scale projects, and that would give them access to better quality food. So for example, through urban markets, through community gardens and popular canteens, we were able to facilitate, by identifying where the gaps were from the food assessment, we were able to facilitate some of these connections. Another result of this work was the identification or the creation of a regional partnership called Alianza por el Buen Vivir, and that was actually convened through the mayor's office and also involves regional planning and regional authorities. So what that means is there is now this capacity that has been created as part of this project so that moving forward there's a bigger conversation around food, and food is seen as a solution for some sustainability challenges. And some of the future work that's being considered are ways to improve these rural and urban linkages. So the next project that I'd like to talk about is the city of Colombo and its city region food system. Through the analysis, the food flow analysis that was undertaken, it became obvious that there were 3 key problems that the city wanted to identify, or the city region wanted to identify. So that's one of the things that came out of these assessment processes is, first of all, people got educated as a group about what the challenges were. And then they were able to collectively identify and prioritize what they wanted to address. So in the case of Colombo, although there's quite low poverty levels in the city, 1/3 of the people in the city are food insecure. So food access is a really important challenge for Colombo. Food safety is also on the radar screen, was identified as something that needed to be addressed. And food waste is also a huge problem. So this, I don't know if you can see this or not because the light, it's not a very big photograph. But there was actually in April of 2017, in one of their garbage dumps, there was a collapse. And these houses were on the edge of the garbage dump, and there was a fire. 23 people died as a result of this collapse. So dealing with waste is a really, really pressing issue. And several of the people who died were children. So there's a need to think about this in a very sort of expeditious way. So what we identified was the thing, or what the researchers in that community identified, was that there were opportunities for creating a more robust network of policymakers and institutions, again, the same as in Medellin, that by understanding food as a lever could address some very important issues. And this translated actually into bylaws, which is really, it's actually kind of impressive that they were able to move this through the system so quickly, because within 2 years of getting this project started, they actually had, they were developing bylaws that were going to address food waste and also food loss. So that's sort of the food security issues, and also issues around food safety. So within a very short amount of time, given the activated task force that was convened to address these issues, they really actualized results very quickly. And what has also happened is, in the meantime, while this project has been going on, there's been a move to create a mega urban structure, a megapolis. And because food was on the radar screen of policymakers while this megapolis was being developed, food is now on the megapolis agenda, hopefully. It looks like that's another good contribution from this work. So just to summarize really quickly, the city region food systems approach enables integration, knowledge mobilization, multi-stakeholder engagement. It obviously builds capacity and also cross-governmental links. And I don't know if this is going to work or not, but it also provides policy tools. So we have a toolkit that's in a beta version, so it doesn't have all of the support that it will in the next few weeks. But what this does is it allows people who weren't in the pilot project, so outside that 7-city project, to enact and take on this city region food systems approach if they want. So this is basically a how-to conduct your own city region food system project. So it introduces a toolkit, it tells people how to get prepared and convene meetings. It talks about how you define a city region food system, establish a vision, how do you do your city region food system scans, so what can those food flow analyses look like? And then it goes on to talk about supporting policy and also governance issues. So if you're interested in that, you can check it out. There's another project that I'm not going to get into now because I'm running out of time. But what I wanted to point to finally, and this is, I'm sure many people in the room are familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals and all the initiatives related to that. But one of the things that's interesting is when we start to put on this sustainability lens, and in this case I've used food as an example. This is from a paper that's about to come out in the Journal of Sustainability. What we find is we can start to articulate many different benefits around this lens of food. And I mean, we could put water there, or we could put health, but I do food because that's what I do, right? It's a little bit self-serving. But by putting food and nutrition security and improved livelihoods at the center of this diagram, we can actually deal with economic issues, local economic development issues. We can talk about climate change. We can talk about improved urban-rural linkages, healthier food systems, so giving people better access to food. In the Keto project, one of the major findings was gender, so women in urban food systems and how their livelihoods can be improved. So, and water quality, for example. So if we have better managed food systems, that can have spin-off benefits for improved water systems. So I think that's it. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Terry, and it's an absolute pleasure for me to be back here in Cardiff. I'm based in Sydney, in Australia, and of course that's in the state of New South Wales. And so here I am in Old South Wales tonight, reflecting on these questions of sustainable placemaking. And in my 20 minutes, I originally trained as a medical medical doctor, and I wanted to give a particular perspective from human health, and framing it in this context of planetary health. So places in this broader context, and a key being that we all need to be thinking more deeply about safeguarding the health and well-being of current and future generations. And here in Wales, of course, with your well-being of future generations, ACT, you're ambitiously trying to step up internationally in this precise space. So it's terrific for me to be here learning with you. So I was pleased to be one of the commissioners on the Rockefeller Foundation Lancet Commission on Planetary Health, and that idea for that commission actually came from Richard Horton, who is the editor of the Lancet, and it was from a meeting in 2013 in China where the Rockefeller Foundation was reviewing their work over their first 100 years and reflecting on what they might focus on if they had 100 more years as a foundation. And Richard Horton made a compelling case for more focus on the ecological and social context of health. Because when we think about human health, we mostly tend to think about it through the lens of a contemporary biomedical understanding of health. And there's no doubt that biomedicine has made enormous strides in recent decades, and all of us in places like Wales benefit from those advances. But what we've lost in one sense is an understanding that human health and well-being fundamentally depends on the health of natural systems. For the air we breathe, the food we eat, as was pointed out in the previous presentation, all of the resources that we derive from nature are fundamental for our future health and well-being. And that's where this concept comes from. The report of the Commission was entitled Safeguarding Human Health in the Anthropocene Epoch, this new epoch in which humans are now changing Earth systems to such an extent that we'll see it in the fossil record. And the report was published in 2015. Here's a list of commissioners, and they come from a variety of disciplinary backgrounds and regions of the world. But the bottom line here on this slide is that this piece of work was essentially a review of literature and key policy recommendations. So it was building on previous work. The Brundtland Commission in the 1980s, remembering of course that Dr. Brundtland was a medical doctor before she was Prime Minister of Norway, and the work of the IPCC that includes work on health. Importantly, the work of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, when Kofi Annan was leading the UN, that really shone the light on these connections between health and ecosystems. But if we draw the lens back further historically, then in my field, in medicine, certainly Hippocrates is a key person. And so he's considered the father of medicine. And this is one of his treatises more than 2,000 years ago in ancient Greece on airs, waters and places. So here we are, Sustainable Places Research Institute, but we need to reflect back on this foundational thinking and reclaim that thinking and position it more centrally in our work today. And indeed, we can go further back. I happen to be born in New Zealand. My background is Ngāi Tahu Maori and Scottish, and Waiora is a Maori word from well-being. That's a composite word, wai meaning water and ora meaning life. And all Indigenous spiritual traditions are founded in an understanding of the connections between people and nature. So planetary health might be a new idea in academic circles and a new term that we're using, but these are definitely foundational understandings. So what were the findings of the Commission? We found that by almost any measure, the human population is healthier now than ever before. So this is World Bank data from 2011, and the black line there that you can see in the middle of the chart, the dates being from 1960 on the left through to 2010, you can see that through this phase, through this 50-year period, human health has been improving on average around the world. And in fact, when you look at all of those coloured bars, which are the different regions, those coloured lines, in every region, health has been improving. There's clearly still great inequity in Africa and South Asia, but health is improving through this phase. But in achieving those health improvements, we've exploited the planet at an unprecedented rate. So when we think about carbon dioxide emissions, ocean acidification, energy use escalating, global deforestation, water use, fertiliser use, the list goes on. And the idea of planetary boundaries, of course. Johan Rockström from Sweden advancing this concept that we're beginning to exceed the limits of the Earth system. And indeed, this whole idea of planetary thinking, moving from thinking about the global, which we've been focusing on. Some years ago, we focused on the international. Then we went through this strong focus on the global. But now the whole idea of the planetary thinking. What's different about that when we start to think in this way? So we defined planetary health at the Lancet Commission as the health of human civilization and the state of the natural systems on which it depends. And I can't expect you to see these links here in detail, but the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, around 2005, articulated this spectrum of links between environmental change and human health. With escalating pressures on natural systems, we're seeing a range of environmental changes, climate change being one important example, but also stratospheric ozone depletion, forest clearance, those boundaries that we mentioned before, and a range of health effects, direct, ecosystem mediated, and indirect. So a range of different pathways that we need to be considering. If we skip forward to the core conclusions, though, of the Commission, is that solutions do lie within reach. I think it's important for us to remember that we know enough to act. We don't need necessarily to put all our energy into new discovery research, new technologies. Much of what we need to do is already known. And so it's very much about putting that knowledge to effect. We found three broad sets of challenges. The conceptual challenges. And here I use the example of our focus on GDP as a measure of progress. And here tonight, if I was to give Terry $1 and say, Terry, do your best to increase GDP here in Cardiff, what would be the best thing for him to do? He could certainly, as a doctor, I could say, go and buy an apple. That'll keep you healthy, spend that dollar wisely. But if he was deliberately wanting to focus on GDP, the best thing to do would be to buy a box of matches and burn down this building. And the reason that would raise GDP is that within months, it would be rebuilt. And there would be economic activity here in Cardiff to rebuild the building. So clearly that is not progress. So I think it's a very clear example that GDP is not measuring progress, it's measuring economic activity. And so if we're to measure progress, we have to complement measures of our economic activity with measures of human development and measures of the state of the environment. So those are some of the conceptual challenges, the phase of imagination and thinking about what is actually progress. Secondly, the governance challenges. If you like, these are the phase of implementation. And here I refer to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act here in Wales, because we have big challenges all around the world, and the governance challenges are very much about the decisions we need to make in this context of uncertain futures, and also the decisions we need to make to invest across a range of portfolios in government. How do we realise the synergies from investment in different sectors? And I think, as I mentioned earlier, that Wales, with this new 2015 legislation, essentially national legislation for sustainable development, we all need to be learning together about what's the difference when you're governing in the context of future generations, when you're thinking much more deliberately about what you're leaving behind for future generations. What will be different about the way Wales is governed? And then finally, the research and information challenges. And here tonight, we're focusing on bridging those disciplines because we've had this remarkable explosion of knowledge in recent decades during this period that's called the Great Acceleration since the 1950s, but we've ended up going down a range of different pathways in the different disciplines. And how do we bring that back together? Here's a link to the Lancet Commission report, and there's a range of useful infographics and other video information that's well worth having a look at when you get a chance. As I bring the threads together in this discussion, I want to point to this specific work, and it's some work I referred to in the new Handbook of Nature that Terry has been editing with the support of the team at Sustainable Places Research Institute in recent years, and just published. I think we saw the weighty tomes at the meeting. But in the contributions that I made, I referred to the work of this ecologist, Stephen Boyden. And in particular, I think this book is very important. The Biology of Civilization, Understanding Human Culture as a Force in Nature. So human culture is the problem, but importantly, human culture change can be the solution. A key in Boyden's work is this idea of a transition to biosensitive ways of living in ways that are in tune with nature. And this triangle, I think, is a very elegant communication device. Remembering that this is coming from an ecological perspective. And in ecology, we use the term human activities to describe everything that people are doing on Earth on any day, whether we're doing those things individually or collectively. And that everything that we're doing has the potential for positive or negative impacts on our health and well-being through a range of pathways, direct and indirect, but importantly also positive or negative impacts on the health of natural systems, and that there'll be feedbacks between these impacts. And then when we're thinking about sustainable places, we're thinking about developing places that will ultimately affect human activities. So we need to be thinking about these multiple pathways at once. Boyden also reminds us that when we're thinking about places and sustainable places, we need to remember the set of universal health needs that we all share. We tend to focus often on the biophysical when we're thinking about this. So the air we're breathing, the water we're drinking, the food we're eating, the pathogens we might be exposed to, the climatic conditions, but we perhaps are not focusing enough on the psychosocial needs here on the right. The need for an emotional support network, the experience of conviviality in our places, the opportunities for cooperation. How do we plan for that? How do we encourage it? How do we develop that within our places? And here's where systems thinking is very important. At the meeting today, we've been discussing this quite a bit. There's a number of important pieces of work happening at the Sustainable Places Research Institute. And the value of systems thinking is that it enables us to understand the dynamic interactions between decisions we might make in one sector and the range of potential implications of those decisions. It also enables us to understand the concept of feedback and how the things we do might propel a situation in a direction that we're not striving for. Policy resistance, why we're stuck in my field, the obesity epidemic is a good example of we seem to be stuck despite a lot of investment in public health interventions, people are continuing to put on weight in most parts of the world. Leverage points, where are the opportunities for change? And then importantly, unintended consequences. Because in all of the work we do, we have to be alert for the fact that we could actually make things worse. If we come back to Hippocrates, a key is to first do no harm. And in relation to sustainable places, a couple of specific examples of these system problems. And if I use the example of unintended consequences, 200 years ago, here in Britain, there were very significant health problems in industrialising cities, which led to the development of what was called the garden cities movement, ultimately. So urban planning, contemporary urban planning, the whole idea of a garden city was, at least in part, a response to these health challenges in industrial cities, where people were facing health problems from pollution, crowding, unclean water, lack of sanitation. Fast forward to the 21st century, that model of urban development was exported to my country, Australia, to Canada, to the United States, and then we had a new technology come along, the affordable motor car with Mr. Ford, and then suddenly urban sprawl took off and reshaped cities. And so an ideal that was in many ways a very sensible response to separate where people lived from where they worked in those industrial times and until the pollution could be controlled, has now ended up delivering a whole lot of new health problems. And many of you may have heard about the health impacts of urban sprawl, the sedentary living, a key part of the obesity epidemic, well documented now in North America and elsewhere. Obviously great concerns about air pollution in many parts of the world as a result of motor vehicle emissions, and indeed mental health challenges in this context. So unintended consequences, an intervention that was meant to make things better, actually leading to a whole new set of problems. Feedback, this is very dear to my heart in Australia, this example, climate change increasing the intensity of heat waves, which is leading to increased demand for air conditioning, thereby increasing energy use and greenhouse gas emissions from climate control in homes and workplaces. And indeed, it's led to our government recently being concerned about energy security and quite dysfunctionally proposing to invest in new coal-fired power stations. And it's just, you couldn't imagine anything more ludicrous. But there's things that we can do to cool down our cities naturally, by growing more vegetation, designing the buildings differently, orienting them differently, and Terry's group has funding from the British Council to look at this in both the Asian context, where these issues are critically important, as well as a local context. So a few final words about the approach that we're taking to bringing the disciplinary perspectives together. We're using an approach we call collaborative conceptual modelling, developed by Barry Newell and Katrina Proust at Australian National University. And it's a 6-step process with 2 phases. So in the first 3 steps, we're trying to understand conceptually what's going on from different disciplinary perspectives. So firstly, at the top there, what is the challenge? Defining the problem and thinking about the same problem from the variety of different perspectives. Then, what is the story? Remembering that there's always a history that's relevant. How did we get here? Why are we in this situation? And then thirdly, can I see how you think? Can we draw this as a set of influences? And can I, as a doctor, see how the urban planner thinks about the same problem? And then the second phase, which is when we can begin to quantify and model what's going on, what's driving system behaviour, point 5, the step 5, where are the leverage points, where are the opportunities for change, and then notably step 6, can we see with new eyes? So we're looking at a problem, can we reflect on that and learn from it? I think this is my either my final slide or my second last slide, and this brings us back to Stephen Boyden's work. And I realise certainly down the back it'll be hard for you to see, but this is our attempt at a conceptual framework for the total system that I think is helping us, certainly in the work we're doing at the University of Sydney, to understand how these various eco-social influences come together, and notably the importance of human culture. So over here, the cultural system, the cultural options, in the first box here, human culture, our worldview, what we know, what we believe, what we prioritise. There are options here, and inevitably we make choices. And what we choose here will affect the way we organise ourselves in our society. The governance arrangements we put into place, the economic system, the regulations, and our education system, what we teach future generations about. Those cultural options, though, importantly, will ultimately affect a range of biophysical options. The human population, the number of people, how they group, the densities, the things people do collectively, the fuels we're using, how we manufacture, how we farm, and the things we do as individuals, our lifestyles, our livelihoods, how we travel, and the things we make, the artefacts, the buildings, the roads, the vehicles. Those biophysical options, of course, affect the broader biosphere, the biophysical environment, if you like, with its physical elements, the atmosphere, ocean, clay and rocks, and the living elements, the plants and animals and microorganisms. So this is a schema for the total system, but the bottom line here is that the health of humans and other animals and more generally natural systems, the health of soil, the health of the climate system, if you like, are emergent properties from the way this works. And when we're thinking about sustainable places, we need to keep these in mind, because we're essentially thinking about how we optimise this sort of system in the interests of future generations. Oh, here's my final key messages. Arguably, my discipline, medicine, has been part of the problem in sustainable placemaking. And I say that because of the contemporary focus on biomedical understandings of health. As important as they are, they don't allow us to take this broader ecosystem perspective on health. That said, although we're part of the problem, we can be part of the solution, and we should be, because human health is a natural integrator. Ultimately, when we're thinking about our places, we're developing those places, we're thinking about them deeply, at least partly in the interests of human health, well-being, security, opportunity in our places. And so they are natural integrations. And my core message, I think, from the talk is that human ecology and systems thinking complement epidemiology for understanding human health in this sustainable development discourse. So thanks very much.
Hello everyone, I'm happy to be here. I've been here a couple of times actually, and my longest time was when I was here as a visiting scholar at the Sustainable Places Institute a couple of years ago. Today I will hope be a little bit briefer, but I wanted to draw on some experiences that I've had over a long period of years, 25 or so, on both specific interdisciplinary research projects relating to sustainable development, implementation, policy integration for sustainability, sustainable development in the Swedish mountain region with natural scientists and social scientists a myriad of disciplines, some, well, in the beginning 40 people and then 20 people over 8 years. And then also from my, my role when I was Deputy Director in Stockholm Environment Institute, which is a truly interdisciplinary institute. When I arrived there some 15 years ago, it was a lot of natural scientists and geographers, and then over the years I've discovered that now there is a lot more social scientists in the institute, and similarly I was part of the build-up of the Stockholm Resilience Center, and we had a similar situation there. So I will be speaking as a social scientist, as a political scientist, from my experience with working with a lot of other disciplines, notably natural science, but also some engineers and so on. So this is the background of my talk. I think everybody in this room is already into this thinking that disciplinary and multidisciplinary research are both needed. They stimulate each other. We need deep disciplinary knowledge as well as working together interdisciplinary. But my experience is that creating true interdisciplinarity is quite a challenge, and this is what I will draw some lessons from. I think that the issue areas that Sustainable Places Institute is engaged in is a truly interdisciplinary endeavor, because you are looking at particular problems, as we have heard with the first two speakers, that are indeed interdisciplinary in character and even transdisciplinary in the sense that they also require society at large to, or particular stakeholders to be engaged as well. But of course, these are not the same multidisciplinary than you working more, in different fields perhaps, and interdisciplinary is supposed to integrate those thinking, and transdisciplinary also get the practitioners on board. However, I've found that in reality, you can read about, what is the difference, but in reality, when you're working with interdisciplinary research on sustainable development, it's often, they sort of go together, these things, in reality. And even in disciplinary research can be an ingredient that is also really important. So where could we meet? In practice, I think defining the agenda, finding the problems that we want to resolve, but we can also meet in terms of the approaches, the methods that and we have had some examples of that already. And this can be surveys, it can be rapid appraisal, but it will also be case studies and systems analysis, etc. The writing process is of course important, where you can actually put your brains together and do joint analysis of a collective data gathering, a critical review of each other's work, and publishing, of course, joint compilation of things like you've done with this massive books about different perspectives, but you can also write truly together. And I think that is even more of a challenge, especially if you are very many people, then you need to know each other really well. But I think communication and outreach is also a way to get together, and I'll come back to that, I think. But this also requires, of course, special skills, and researchers are not always so good at it. A common problem I already talked about, but we have to also think about that even though we might think that we are talking about the same problem, if you start deliberating and going deeper into it, you will find, if you come from different disciplinary perspectives, that you have understood the things very differently. So here it's really important to acknowledge that this is fine. I mean, you can understand it from different angles, and maybe that's actually part of the solution. That's part of the interdisciplinarity, in fact. And in practice, I've found that the different epistemologies that we have from the different research disciplines, and also the cultures that might vary quite a lot, especially if you take the extremes of history or humanities and medicine or engineering. It can be very different and inhibiting, but also enriching. But then you have to listen. You have to take time to listen. Another thing that I've found over the years is that we often talk with a similar concept, but they mean very different things. Just take an example, community. If you talk to a plant, an expert in biology, they think of plant communities. In political science, we think about a community, maybe how it's governed. And a sociologist would think different, a historian would think different, etc., etc. So it's important to listen here as well, and not take for granted that everybody has understood this the same way. And another practical example that I had in this Mountain Mister program, we talked about management. And of course, the fish expert, he thought it was about how many fishes you could pull up from the lake and how you can manage that. Whereas we as political scientists, of course, would think of management on a much higher level of how the whole organization is set up, and how the county administration is working with the different stakeholders and so on, and how they together manage the whole system as such. Finally, a thing that is really important, I think, and I think you have discovered that in sustainable places as well, that mutual respect and interest, and you have to have some fun together and have a personal chemistry that works. So a lot of social events can help that. Another thing is that interdisciplinary research requires a lot of time, and plan for that, because it requires, especially if you haven't worked together before, you have to get to know each other. Maybe you should actually have some outings and do things together to get to know each other personally, and build up faith and trust in each other. And I've been in some of these, well, I told you about this sustainable development in the mountains, which was originally 40 people, and many of them were like 10%, 20%, and so on. It was horrible to get all these people. I mean, people would opt out, and they didn't have time to come, and they didn't have time to listen. They were just into their own thing and wanted to deliver, and that doesn't work. So interdisciplinary projects need to be sufficiently staffed, and my experience is that 40% or at least 30% of your time should be devoted, because otherwise there is a danger that all the time will be used for meetings and you can't actually deliver anything, because all this talk takes time. And then, of course, with the junior people, the PhD students and so on, they have to be also planning for their career, so they have to have time for their disciplinary deep knowledge as well, going to courses and so on. This means that you have to be cautious to actually have sufficient number of senior staff who can devote more time, and maybe have the PhD students support the process rather than be on top of it, because there is a danger otherwise, at least with our academic cultures and how we get appointments later on, that if there aren't any interdisciplinary units in the university, it might be difficult to continue. And then, of course, leadership for these endeavors and clear responsibilities are really important, even in the smaller groups. The smallest such research project that I was part of was only 5 senior researchers, but even there leadership was important, because you need, you can't, everybody can't be a leader even if you're at the same level, so to speak. So I've already talked about some of this, that we have the different professional identities and cultures in the disciplines, and that we have different norms and so on. Financing and endurance, I think it's important to have sufficiently long time, unless you are a team who have worked together several times, then you can do a little tag-on project. But if you don't know each other from the start, it takes a lot of time. So the projects and the engagements have to be long enough. And of course, physically, you have to have places to meet. So a difficulty that we had in some of the projects was that, you know, we were in completely different faculties and so on, and then you have to find somewhere where there's a neutral ground, so to speak, to meet. And maybe get away is a way to do that, actually. And go into the mountains is always nice, right? When appropriate, involvement of stakeholders and target groups can be also really rewarding in terms of interdisciplinarity. And in this long-term mountain research, we actually engaged them both in the definition of the problems to be researched, but also along the way we had hearings and engagement from the different stakeholders, from everything from indigenous peoples to business, sustainable tourism and so on, and county administrations, etc. But of course, the expectations must be right, and often they are asking for more hands-on, quick information rather than long-term research. So you have to also engage them in the beginning really well and have a continuous dialogue to have the right expectations of what will come out of the research. Of course, with what we had a full-time communicator in the last 2 years of that big research program, that helped a lot, because that person could help both to make this communication much more professional, outward looking, but also get us as researchers to say things in a way that can be understood outside our academic quarters, so to speak. So I think it's really important to have these both coordination and communication functions to be amply funded for it to be working. Just a few, if I have a few minutes left. There are some perceived traps, especially if social scientists are coming into dominating natural science or engineering, or I don't know, I haven't worked with medicine, but probably the same thing there, because the other part, non-social scientists, they often feel superior in a way. There are more citations, they have a different culture of publishing with each other, big groups, etc. And many social scientists, I think these traditions are changing, in fact, but when I started off, I mean, the thing was to write on your own. You know, that was the good thing. You write a book on your own. But the traditions, when you work interdisciplinary, it would be you write just a section or something, and you aren't in control of the whole thing. So it's a completely different thing. And there's also a danger to make social scientists use quantitative methods, because it feels more secure, you know, for those who don't understand. So often we are seen as more arbitrary and with simple insights that some natural scientists say that they already knew, but actually they didn't, because they didn't say it before we said it. So, and that's a problem. And it's also a problem that often the social sciences are seen as one discipline, like homogeneous discipline, whereas we have very different approaches within the social sciences, methods and epistemologies as well. So that is a problem. And we are often expected to resolve policy problems and do more of consultancy work rather than pursue critical research in the eyes of some. So those are traps that we need to be aware of, and to be aware of that we should be in the planning from the onset and not tagged on as an extra, you know, to have some policy orientation at the end. I think it's important to state that even though there is an inclination to see interdisciplinary research as problem-oriented and to solve policy problems, it can also contribute to true theoretical development, but that this, of course, requires a lot of thinking. And also, I mean, I have this about the domination as well here. So you need the incentives for crossing over the natural science and social science divide. You need more ways of rewarding that kind of enterprise. And unfortunately, I don't think our universities is doing that very much, rather the contrary sometimes. So this is something you have to work with in your projects or in your research, bigger research endeavors. I think you recognize my point here, because we'll be discussing today actually in the Sustainable Places Institute discussions that old programmatic or thematics might need to be revisited after some time, that you need to rejuvenate and get inspirations from new developments, but also, of course, over some time you have already come so far. That engaging with decision makers can be really rewarding and stimulating and useful, but maybe not all the time. You have to think about when is the opportunity right, when can we have the right expectations on that kind of interaction, so that they don't become disappointed because you cannot deliver what they really wanted. So long-standing personal networks with stakeholders can be very good, because then you know more about their expectations. In essence, I've listed lots of problems and issues to be dealt with, but I mean, I wouldn't be here if I didn't think it was really rewarding and a lot of fun to be doing interdisciplinary work. And so that's the main message, that it's fun. You should do it because you learn so much more than what you would have done otherwise. So thank you.
Hello, my name's Emma Price and I work with artists, commission artists. So I do feel a slight imposter to this talk at the moment. However, saying that, it's really refreshing that the debates that you're having in the social sciences and about placemaking are the same conversations we're having within the arts. So how artists can affect change, can go into communities, talk about the environment and so forth. So I just wanted to say how refreshing it was to see that we're not on our own going in on a theoretical level, but also on a practical level, particularly artists in residencies who have a durational time in a community or indeed on a subject. So it was just to say that's really interesting and that we're not alone. And to ask a brief question, do you work with artists and have you worked with artists in your own particular fields? Thank you.
Okay, that's one question. I'll take two other comments or questions. Yeah, would you like to introduce yourself? And just...
Hello, I'm Gary Jones, retired from Newport University. How would the panel reconcile the political changes we're seeing right now with regard to food sustainability in particular, with the difficulties of interdisciplinary research and the complexities of research and implementing change in connection with that?
Just on the topic of theorizing, thinking about what Katarina said there, and I hadn't really thought about it in that respect, working in interdisciplinary teams, but not just necessarily towards policy or some sort of applied result, but working in an interdisciplinary team towards the creation of new theory. And I wonder if any of the three of you have had experience with that. My hunch is that that would really place you at the cutting edge of the research landscape.
I'm happy to lead off about the important question about art and engaging with artists. And the answer to the question is yes. And indeed, I often reflect that the work that I've done with visual artists has been among the most creative work that I've been involved in my professional career. And I'll point to a specific piece of work we did when I was based at Australian National University, and it was a collaboration between the National Centre for Epidemiology and the School of Art. And it was focused on what we call the contested landscapes of Western Sydney. So it was looking at urban development, urban expansion, urban sprawl, if you like, in Western Sydney, and the contest between housing as a form of land use with food growing, because that part of Sydney was the first food bowl in the nation, and that the value of working with artists was, I guess, twofold. Firstly, as a way as scientists, we initially briefed the artists, and then they made their artworks using a range of different media, and then exhibited it in the community. So it was a terrific way of engaging the community in the science, but through the arts. Because people have, if you like, often stopped listening when we put up these charts and tell us stories of the problems. It's not engaging people in their hearts. They're thinking about it, but through the arts, we can engage more emotionally with communities. And the other great thing about it was that the art then influenced the scientists. And so it was there was a feedback in terms of thinking and reflecting on their science and the way they approached it. So yeah, it's been of tremendous value. Yeah.
The comments on that or the other two questions?
Yeah. We haven't yet engaged with artists. However, we sort of accidentally did it. A colleague of ours who works in a not-for-profit organization that focuses on seed saving, out of a book project that we had last year, he wrote a poem called "The Fractured Food Systems Blues." And yeah, well, exactly. So it's being and it's spun off all these other interesting side projects, very small at this point. But what it's told us is this, as Tony's saying, it's a really great way of getting our messages out. That's much more accessible, and I think that that's something we're going to be doing more of. And I love the example that you gave. So that I think there's a lot of, yeah, we're just not quite there yet in the research that we've been doing, but that's something we would hope to do more of in the future. If I can address the question about food specifically, okay. And policy, I think that was the question you were asking, in the current policy environment. I can't speak to the current policy environment here because I don't really have any expertise in that. But although I think that there's lots of good policy pieces that can be brought together that can facilitate positive conversations around things. I know that one of the things that we found through the through the city region food systems work, and also through work that's happening in Canada, is that our sort of moving between scales and having things in place that help to address pressing issues is a way to help get food on the policy agenda as a way to solve problems. So a colleague of mine who used to be the manager for the Toronto Food Policy Council, which is a very grounded initiative in Toronto, used to say that he had a series of reports in his desk drawer that he could pull out. So if somebody was interested in waste or food insecurity or any of the different issues that link to food, he had a solution. And I think that as long as we're looking for solutions in terms of policy, it's a very practically driven way to do work, but that's one way of doing it. So looking for the ways that we can put things together in a problem, a solutions-based way, which I don't know if that answers your question somewhat.
Some of it, my concern was the short-term scale of things with Brexit I have in mind, frankly, with risk of food security, and the longer-term scale of implementing change to meet the demands of that political change. Yeah. That was behind my question. I didn't put it rather well in the first place.
No. Well, I kind of got where you were coming from. I just don't feel qualified to comment on it because it's not something that I've studied. But I think the more prepared people are to deal with situations and circumstances, and the more proactive you can be, and the more you can look at things as solutions-oriented, then, you know, to the extent that whatever's going to unfold, because I mean, there's so many question marks now. And also looking to other places that have good practices that would make sense as well is also a good way to address that, maybe.
Thank you.
And then the theory question. I think it's constant iteration in terms of the theory and the practice. And I'm not going to get this right. I think it's Elinor Ostrom, but I'm not sure, said that good theory can always work in good theory can always work in practice. So I think that to the extent that we want to have theoretical and conceptualizations of what's happening in the world, it has to make sense in practice as well. So I think the iteration, because we're not creating theory just to have theory, right? It has to be grounded in what's happening in practice. So I think that the more that our research is doing that iterative thing, the more relevant the theory is, and also the more we can identify. The more we work together, the more we can identify these common points of intersection between the different disciplines, and that helps to develop more meta theories to the extent that we can have them. Maybe, I don't know, that's probably oversimplistic, but
I can also give some answers to those two questions, not about the political changes, but the other two, because when I worked in the Stockholm Resilience Center, and still they are working a lot with artists, so that's a constant kind of endeavor to both for themselves, I think, to visualize things, but also to engage with the larger communities. And these some of these exhibitions have traveled around, I don't know the whole world, but at least extensively as well around different countries. So that is indeed a way to communicate very much. But of course, if you have full-time communicators, that helps because they know how to deal with this as well and how to engage the researchers in a way that you explained about. And I also believe that working towards theory should be part of most larger, at least, projects where you both have some kind of practical, you're working towards solving some practical things, but also how to conceptually understand those practical things. That is theorizing. And the whole social ecological systems work is, of course, developing theory, because that wasn't there before. So, I mean, all of this, I think, has theoretical implications as well. But of course, in our daily work, we may not think so much about that. We are developing theory as we go along and investigate things together with new perspectives, because that is indeed theoretical development.
Excellent. Just let me pick up a little bit on this issue of political, because I think it is really quite important in the UK context, but not only there, in other parts of the world. just come back from the US. You know, there's a lot of depression going on at the moment about short-termism and the geopolitical rise of nationalism and popular right movements across Europe. So we're in a world here which is changing, and I think it has changed over the lifetime of the Institute, actually. And we have to sort of confront that, I think. We have to sort of confront it and say, well, because what's part of this, of course, is a rubbishing of science in many cases. You know, we've had a minister for the environment who said we don't need any more experts. Yeah, we don't need any experts. So, you know, we live in ideological times. We have to recognise that sort of point. So one of the things we're doing in the Institute, we're learning about perhaps a more practical way of communicating our work, not only with, not just relying on, let's say, a linear relationship between scientists and policy makers, whatever they are, because they're not listening. There's an institutional deafness out there, right? Antagonism, even. So when we talk about these interfaces, I think we've got to be much more clever about how and smart about how we do it. Maybe we emphasise more partnerships with civil society, with communicating the truth, right, which is under threat, to different levels and participative groups in these societies. So I think we're having a debate informally about what the most effective ways are of dealing with this. Clearly critique, but also shouldn't stop us communicating and having an impact, but we have to do it in a more nuanced and smart way, I think, given that some people, for the time being, are not going to listen. You know, I think that's
fewer empty chairs at an event like this.
Well, yeah. Okay, so we'll take another round of points. Yeah, one over there.
All these ideas and theories are excellent, but how are they going to have an impact on the global market, private market, economics that's actually running the planet at the moment?
Okay, good. Yep. As first speaker talked about food waste problem, Colombo. I wondered, as an extension, there had been thought of using this massive food waste as a waste to energy, as one way of making good use of it. The second speaker, you talked about, yes, the advances in public health, but there seems to be new threats, not just plastics that we've heard about, but Silicon Valley had these tech companies pumping out the iPods, computers, etc., 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 and the heavy metals, the heavy chemicals, the toluene, the benzene, the lead, the copper cyanide, which they put into their storage, and then solvents get through to the ground. So even got a Google building, they thought they cleared it away, despite there finally being actions, by the authorities. But it's too late. It's got through the ground. It's got through the Google building, and it seems to be the response of Silicon Valley, just to chuck that all over to China. So, and there we're really having all the waste going into the rivers, and the groundwater and the rivers being polluted, but doesn't seem to end there. It come home to roost because it's coming out through into the air and getting led back in the USA. So what can be done with regard to this very, very dangerous, massive threat, I would say, to public health? Otherwise, we're...
Okay, I think one more. Yeah, over here.
Yes, Tony Capon mentioned a use of inappropriate measures, which, for example, with GDP. But of course, people feel safe in using measurements that people understand. How do we redefine measurements as appropriate to future sustainability and overcome the commitment that we have to existing measures and the infrastructure that has itself?
Okay, just one more.
I'm Esther from Malaysia. I just would like to ask for the third speaker, when you talk about the challenges in interdiscipline. So it's quite surprised me when you just talk about like the mutual understanding, all these challenges, because I've been to others conference and meeting also among the academics, and one of the comments and the mutuals comments from the academic, they would talk about the challenges on finding data. So I'm not sure whether is it like here the data is quite open and then we can get it quite easily. So that is my questions would like to ask. Yeah.
Right, well, I'll go back to our increasingly tiring speakers, just as 4 sorts of issues there. 2 of them were linked together. One was economic orthodoxy and measurement, GDP.
Maybe I'll say a few things in response there. I mean, we're actually pretty close here to the University of Surrey, where Tim Jackson, of course, doing very important work on the idea of prosperity without growth. And I know that the Learned Society of Wales is planning an event in the coming months here in the UK on the concept of sustainable prosperity. You know, what would be different if we genuinely strived for sustainable prosperity, and I think that's a very important discussion for us to have, not just as academics, but with the wider community. The second point about pollution is enormously important and poorly understood. Indeed, quite recently there was another Lancet commission specifically on the health problems of global pollution. And one of the things that I think is quite interesting in relation to pollution, and particularly air pollution in Asia, is that it does seem that understanding air pollution, and for people of China having now real-time information about air pollution levels in Beijing and other cities, is leading to concern being raised with the government of China, and indeed the government officials are concerned as well. And so the improvements in information and technology are having a positive in that direction in terms of beginning to get action on that, at least an acknowledgement of the problem, and the need for action. Whether that action will be appropriate remains to be seen. But indeed, that seems to be driving the work to reduce carbon pollution, almost like an additional benefit of that. It's not direct in relation to carbon pollution. Always it's sometimes it's about those more immediate human health concerns in relation to direct pollution. But it's definitely an area where we need to pay much more attention the health consequences of pollution. And once these pollutants get into the broader water system and the groundwater, and obviously potentially getting into the food system as well. Concerns about fracking in that very short-term drive for fossil fuel energy, but what that might mean in the longer term in terms of our water system. So, you certainly point to very important questions there. One,
the economic, basically moving the production from the USA to countries where they'll know there'll be less regulatory controls, and so it then gets out it's put out directly into the rivers, and so the groundwater is directly affected, and so massive increase in cancers from the people concerned. So it's deliberate multinational company making use of.
Effectively exporting the pollution, but the consumption levels remain the same. So yeah, I mean, one important development is that China's beginning to refuse to take that waste back. Australia, for example, was exporting a lot of its recycled waste to China for reprocessing, but effectively China's calling time on that, and then it puts the pressure back on high-income countries to reduce the amount of waste that they're producing. So, hopefully that will have some positive impact in some contexts at least.
Yeah. Any comments on the other question?
Yeah, why don't I answer the big question from the back? How are these ideas going to have an impact on the market globally? Of course, there are wishes, and there are, real situations. But I think, as a political scientist, I would like to see this in different levels of society, because things are happening a lot at the local level in many societies, driven by community concerns and visible problems that you have to deal with. And these movements are increasingly becoming connected, not least through social media and so on, by the global networks that we have now. So that's one layer. And then you have actually the market forces themselves, because we as consumers also behave in different ways, and being more informed, we, at least I'm dependent on which society, but I'm surprised as to Sweden. In Sweden, we are way beyond 25% of our consumption is now eco-labeled and so on. So it can happen very quickly, and nobody actually anticipated that. And the agriculture sector is now turning completely, in a new direction, where they are thinking in how to get a circular economy and so on. And this is also penetrating the political, the different venues for political discussion. Both at the local government level, but also national level, and increasingly we all know that things are happening even at the international level, even if there are ups and downs with these things. But since the awareness is so much higher now than if you compare with Rachel Carson, Silent Spring or something, this is a change that cannot be stopped, I think, even though there will be, going up and down. The financial, how the financial market works is another issue that I'm not an expert on, but I think that is something that we also need to bring into this sustainability discourse, and have increasingly economists and financial experts to think about how can this not only be measured in a different way in GDP, but also how can the financial markets work in a more sustainable manner, because they have caused many of the problems lately as well.
Alison, do you want to make any comments? You don't have to, but
just one quick one, also sort of a general one, is that I think, and not to be too Pollyanna-esque about this, because there's lots of problems with the United Nations, but I think the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are helping to change the conversation. Because what's happening at the global level, or at the national level, sorry, is every country in the world is having to go through what's called a voluntary national review process. And there's 4 of them starting in 2015 going to 2019, and every country has to stand up in front of the world at the United Nations and report on what they're doing and how they're moving towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And the only way you can achieve your Sustainable Development Goals is by pushing it down to the local level. Right? So I think that there's conversations happening because of this international initiative that's going to be, is going to be increasingly interesting in the future. So, and maybe I can talk to you afterwards about waste.
Okay, thank you. Hesitate to ask if there are any other questions. I think we've got so far. I think personally we're actually in a very interesting period at the moment, and I understand the let me put it with pessimism about the way things are going, which we read about in the right-wing press in this country at the moment. But I do agree that, in fact, we're on a process of transition. You see that happening, particularly in the energy sector. It's happening in the food sector. We're seeing rapid potential changes here, and it's both pull and push factors. The financial industry, our Bank of England director, Mark Carney, has been warning for quite a long time for the insurance industry and the financial sector. Get your act together, because you're going to be in a field of stranded assets. You're not going to be able to get it out of the ground. So if you're going to try and keep with these carbon-based assets, you're going to be in problems and you're going to lose money. And we're seeing sovereign wealth funds and all sorts of other examples of moving to ethical forms of investment, including universities, interestingly, and, after a struggle in some cases, hunger strikes and everything else. So that there are significant push factors which are actually moving global capitalism, in my view, to a new regime here. And then there's the pull factors, and this is around practices, sustainable practices and so on, which changing forms of consumption, in energy, as you can see, but also in food and water. So I actually do believe that we're on a transition, notwithstanding political vicissitudes that we may have, which might, obviously kick us back, obviously. And so this is one of the interesting questions, is about to what extent it's a lot easier to knock things out than it is to build things, as we discovered this weekend, So I think, this is one of the challenges about rebuilding and also dealing with these potential kickbacks and negative circumstances in this field. So I'd just like to thank a very provocative and insightful, very experienced syntheses of work that the three speakers have been doing, and for a stimulating session. So thank you very much.